Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Marketing Makes Unmixed episode 9. Today, we have with us a marketing and consumer insights veteran of more than 20 years' experience, Dirk Commandeur. Dirk has worked with reputed companies like P&G, Third Bank, Nielsen, and now he runs his own company, DLC Insight. Dirk, welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well. Thanks so much for having me. I'm looking forward to this.
Uh, Dirk, your career spans an impressive 20 plus years. Tell us about your career journey. How did you get started in marketing and consumer insights?
Sure. Yeah. So I think this is an area, I don't think there's a lot of small children running around saying, oh, someday I want to work in consumer market research or I want to work in this type of industry. And I think that when I first was exposed to this industry, so as I was going through university, I focused most of my studies on the study of philosophy and the study of
Mhm.
economics, and that's where I was first exposed to like the philosophy of social sciences. So things or like abstract logic or what have you. And then in economics, that's where probability and statistics and some core things there that I really enjoyed. And
Mhm.
I was looking at where would I make my first career move or where would I go after graduate school. And I was at one of these career fairs and I met some people from this soap company in Cincinnati, Procter and Gamble,
Mhm.
and they were really engaging, very unusual for not what I was expecting. And so I thought, well, maybe I'll go and work at this place for a year or so. So I think this idea of how can you take the principles that I was studying around things like public choice or industrial organizational design and things like that, and then where can you put those into action in an industry? So I started at Procter and Gamble. I thought I might be there for a year or so. I thought like this is a good place for the resume and a nice place for me to get started. And I thoroughly enjoyed working at P&G. It was a great place to kind of grow up and learn the fundamentals of how to apply consumer market insights into action. So I was there for about 10 years. And then I moved into, as you mentioned, I worked at a retail bank that's based here in the Midwest of the United States, that Fifth Third Bank, and I led their marketing analytics department and some aspects of customer onboarding and so forth. So it was a fascinating time to work in retail banking. I really enjoyed that. And then I had the opportunity to move over to what we would call the supplier side. So I worked at Nielsen for about 8 years in a variety of roles there. And I had the good fortune of working across both as you think about how Nielsen was constructed at that time, both watch and buy. So working in everything from areas that are near and dear to you, such as marketing analytics and market mix modeling, to things like new product innovation. So the work that the team on that is called Bases within Nielsen. So I had the opportunity to work with some great people there, and really enjoyed my time at Nielsen and just had the opportunity to go off on my own. And so back in 2018, I started my own company, as you mentioned, DLC Insight, where I work with a variety of clients to help them better understand their consumers, their patients, their clients, the people that matter most to them, and
Mhm.
gather insights to help them make better business decisions. So I thoroughly enjoy it. I've been doing it for same idea. Each time I've had one of these moves in my career, I thought I would do it maybe for a few months. And like the same, when I hung out my own shingle, I thought maybe I'd do it for a year. And I've just thoroughly enjoyed it. I really have been very fortunate that I have some wonderful clients that I work with, and yeah, keeps me busy and keeps me on my toes. So that brings me here today. Yeah.
Great. Of course, when we talk about consumer insights, people think that they know about it. They think that, hey, it's knowing about what the consumers want. But I'm sure there's so much deeper levels to it. So what is consumer insight and how does it help the brands?
It's a good question, and I know that people have put a lot of thought into like how do you define a consumer insight and what is a useful insight. For me, I think about it very expansively and somewhat simplistic. So I always think of this as what we're really trying to do is understand that we're trying to understand how people are behaving in a marketplace is fundamentally what we're trying to do. And we're trying to be able to look at or understand these individual behaviors and how do we aggregate them in some useful way. And at the end of the day, that's where we come up with a useful consumer insight. But it's interesting. A lot of times we make these distinctions between a consumer insight or a market insight or a brand insight. And for me, these are all like these are somewhat arbitrary pillars that we're developing. And I really think that what we're really talking about, our markets are driven by individual consumer behavior. And so you really have to start with there. And then the idea is, how do you start to bring together in a thoughtful way? How do you start to create a heuristic about how this market works based on what you understand about the consumer? So how do you weave that thread? So that's something I talk about. Like in my business, I had this saying where every day I'm thinking about the consumer, the market, and the brand. So it's the think CMB is kind of my reminder to myself. And so I think this idea of a consumer insight is inextricably linked to what we understand about markets and what we understand about how brands behave in a marketplace. So that's again, I think probably other people have a much more eloquent definition of a consumer insight and so forth. But for me, it just really starts with the foundational behavior that we're trying to understand.
Yeah, that's an excellent acronym to keep in mind. CMB, right? Consumer, market, brand.
Yeah, it's funny. Like early in my career, I kind of wrote this little note at one point on my desk, and I thought, like, okay, well, it's this idea of like, I can have. It's a good day if at some point throughout the day I've made a point to think something about my consumer, about something about the novel about what's happening in the market or the marketplace I'm competing in, and something about my brand. So that's everything that I do today has some touches in some way, consumer choices, market potential, brand health. So I think that's you could do a lot worse than spending a little time every day thinking about each of those like foundational pillars of your business. So.
Yeah, I mean, when I looked at your email ID, I mean, I just wanted to ask, hey, there's the Think CMB. I just wanted to ask, hey, what is Think CMB? Now it all connects. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It is funny. Like I've thought about should I change that or so, but it was really for me. Like it's the type of thing. Every time I see that, it's a mental reminder. Like these are the things I need to be keeping in mind for my clients. And so it's funny. A lot of times people they don't ask. A couple times they brought it up and said, I didn't know. Maybe this was something that. But that's why I have that domain and it was really just as a starting point, just a reminder. Anytime I send an email, I see that little acronym and it reminds me of what I need to focus on for my clients. Yeah.
Yeah, very clever indeed. Yeah. Dirk, how are consumer insights collected? Of course, you've been in the industry for so long. You must have seen, many different methods of collecting consumer insights. The evolution of it, right? I mean, from good old survey-based methodology, and now we have, the social media, and now we are in the era of LLMs. People are talking about synthetic consumer insights also.
Yeah.
So, yeah, if you can, shed some light on it.
Yeah, it's a great question. And so I think this is something that, again, kind of growing up in an organization like Procter and Gamble, which is a lot of people who have spent time at P&G, like I'm always uncomfortable like talking about like, oh, the good old days, or this is how we used to do it at this big company and what have you. I think that in some way could trivialize other people's experiences or experiences you have maybe in small organizations or what have you. But I do think one of the benefits of working in an organization like that is that you had like this sense of the history of how you began gathering these insights or information. So at P&G, they can go all the way back to when they had people going knocking door to door and collecting a tablet or writing down this information and then aggregating it back at the headquarters. And so, yeah, I think this idea of moving from consumer research is very much focused on interrogation. So how do I go and ask you a series of questions and tabulate that information and then look at how that compares to other markets, other consumer groups, how that changes over time. So I think that moving much more from interrogation to observation. And so I think in the past, it was very difficult to observe consumer behavior because consumers were oftentimes moving in marketplaces that were very difficult for us to get line of sight to. So it's not an easy thing to observe someone shopping in a physical retail environment at scale. We can do that at an individual level, what have you. I think that what we've seen is as our marketplaces have changed, our ability to observe behavior in these marketplaces have opened up. And so I think when you talk about online marketplaces that have this native, like digital exhaust that comes out of it, it gives us the ability to think about consumer observation in a fundamentally different way. And so I think that's one of the things that has obviously changed as we think about the changes in the marketplace that have allowed and enabled us to look at more observational data than maybe we would have had in the past. So I think that's a fundamental change. I think there is still a really important role for primary consumer research, for survey data. I use that information almost on a daily basis. But I think that I think the most powerful insights are when you can triangulate or bring together observational information along with maybe information that comes out of surveys or interviews and so forth. So I think that's been this fundamental shift is the availability of more observational data. And I think that in many cases, people are just catching up to that. And the only other observation I'd have is that you mentioned the rapid advancements with LLMs and how that's impacting the industry. And as a small business owner, I see that every day where there is work that I can do on my own that would have required you and I to have had like a massive team in the past. So you think about things like if I'm doing I can conduct an interview, or I can gather ratings and reviews online, or other pieces of information that might be unstructured text or text-based information. In the past, it would require someone reading that, someone trying to parse out what is the sentiment and so forth and so on. But as you know, and this is something that anyone can very easily run pretty elegant analytics against on their own. And so I think that it's very empowering as a small business owner that I have these new tools that if I choose to use these and embrace these, that can help me add more value for my clients that they would have only been able to get by working with a really large firm in the past. So I think there's a lot of operational pieces as well, like how do we gather the information? What are the types of observations we can see? But then also very practically speaking, how do we analyze the data and how do we work through the data in ways that is becoming much more democratized. So
Great, Dirk. And yeah, of course, you work with the big firms like P&G and Nielsen, and you also work with smaller startups and mentor them as well. So the next question is going to be more of like a selfish question because I talked to my friend and a data partner who's into consumer research, and I told him that I'm going to interview Dirk Commandeur, who's an expert in consumer insight, and he said that please place this question for him. So the question is, he's about to start his own company. What are the biggest mistakes you see early stage founders make with respect to consumer research companies?
Well, it's a great question. So first, tell your friend that he's already starting off on a good place, or they are already starting off on a good place by asking the question. So I think that many times the challenge that people have if they are just starting the business or they're working in a small enterprise is one, they think they don't have the time or the resources to go out and listen to their consumers. And in many cases, they feel that like as a founder, it's their job to define this market space, to define this product, to make all of these decisions, to take the risk and so forth. And that somehow by listening to consumers or gathering consumer information, you're going to be less agile, or you're going to be, it's a sign that you're not willing to take risk or so forth. I think people who understand that the importance of trying to delight your consumer, of trying to meet their needs, and that being humble enough to know that maybe you don't have all the answers. that starting off there, like having this philosophy that it's important that all of these decisions you're making somehow are being informed by the people that matter most to you, the people that are going to keep you in business. I think that's an important first start. And then I feel that there's, as much as it's a little bit of what I was alluding to earlier, Venkat, is that there's been such a push where fairly so today it is much easier to gather these insights than it was 10 years ago, 15 years ago.
True.
And so I think you could start with very simple ways of like going through and making sure you're embracing any online feedback about your product or your service, like ratings and reviews, or looking in forums to understand that.
Mhm.
And I think that a lot of this very foundational information, you can go to a coffee shop and you can talk to someone about your product. You can go, there's a lot of things you can do that start to exercise those muscles around
Mhm.
how do I gather that information that doesn't require you to spend thousands of dollars on primary consumer research or what have you. So I think it starts with, like with anything, with you start by identifying it's a need and then spending a little time focusing on it. But it's a great question, and I feel that in today's environment, it's very easy for us to just to listen to our consumers, be it digitally online or physically going and finding them where they are, where they live, and asking them questions. So
Yeah. Thanks, Doug. This was really helpful. I'm sure, he's going to, really put in these insights when he starts his company. Thanks. Next question. Of course, you're an expert in consumer insights, but what are some consumer insights that you have found very insightful in your career, but the general audience, didn't know about it? Have the people changed, or, thereby the insights have changed over the years?
yeah, it's a good question, and so I think that one of the observations that I have is that for in many organizations, there's a we don't recognize that there's this disconnect between how much time and energy our consumers put into their decision
Mhm.
making and how much time and energy we as marketers, as product innovators or whatever have to put into the product. So there's this, because of that, there's like this cultural sometimes disconnect that it's like, because I'm spending my entire day trying to figure out how to optimize this ad or improve this product or think about the how do we win more space at point of distribution, the consumers must be thinking about it in the same way. So I think that like a foundational in most categories, one of the foundational observations or insights is that people do not spend a lot of time thinking about these purchase decisions. People do not spend a lot of time in their day. Like it would be completely irrational if I spent a great deal of time researching toothpaste. And so when I fall back on choice drivers or things that matter to me to help me quickly make a decision in a marketplace, like I think that's something that is many times lost on marketers or is difficult to fully embrace and understand when you're being paid to spend your whole day solving problems or unlocking opportunities within a marketplace. And I've seen that. Like I've seen observations. A lot of times, one of the interesting things is like in qualitative research, when you're working with a team, you might be sitting in a back room or sitting online listening to people to talk. And people will get upset when someone will say, "Well, why did you buy that brand deodorant, or why do you buy that?" Well, it's what my dad bought. That's what we bought. Oh my gosh, we were technically superior or this and that. So I think that's like a fundamental observation: is you have to get comfortable that in many of these marketplaces, people are quickly making these decisions, and even very expensive decisions. People might be looking at doing this in a very in a fashion that you might say that looks cavalier or what have you. But when you get into it, when you think about all the demands on our time, it's a very rational way for us to interact in these marketplaces. So I think people, if you can embrace that, then you can get to a place where you'd say, okay, with that in mind, then with how do I think about maybe a very subtle change in consumer behavior that can have a massive impact on my brand or in this marketplace? And so, especially for larger brands, a very slight change in consumer behavior, which can have a very small change in share, can have a massive impact on profitability. So I think that idea of getting comfortable that sometimes insights of like very subtle behavior or very subtle change can have a pretty massive impact on brand profitability.
Understood. My formal introduction to marketing was through market research around about 12 years ago. And way back then, we conducted a survey, in Bangalore and in other cities, whether, people would switch from Blackberries to, the smartphones. Way back then, smartphones were just getting introduced into India. And we had, listed down a series of brand names, and we asked people, hey, would you switch to this particular brand? And people vehemently said, yes, we would switch from BlackBerry to this brand. But, the very next month when the brand really did launch, the sales were very meek, right? And we were totally astounded. Like, hey, people said on paper that they are going to buy it, but they didn't. From your experience, have you come across such scenarios where what people say and what people do are totally different? And how should marketers prepare for this?
Yeah, of course. I love the observation you just shared because I think we've all seen that. And it's like so many other things. Like there's two ways to when you're faced with something that's confounding like that, like how do you move forward from that? So some people will say that and like, oh, well, this is all worthless. Like this consumer research, people are lying to us or they're not giving us factually correct information. So we can't use it at all. So I think it's more important to understand, well, did that not what was that not consistent with reality, or why was that claimed behavior did not play out in the marketplace? And so I think one of the things that we obviously have observed, and this is not me, this is well established in literature, is that there are certain types of choices that are very hard for people to articulate, especially about future state behavior or future states in a marketplace. So it might be very difficult for me to articulate for me to rationalize a decision that I'm going to make in the future. So if you give me a concept or give me an option, what might be easier for me to do is make choices between two different options or help me understand the relative importance of different options that go into my choice. And so, like in what you just outlined, it might be very difficult for someone to articulate which of these products am I going to buy from a large set. What might be much easier for people to articulate is if given a choice between these two, which one would you select? And now let me run through that in iterative fashion. So a lot of I'm a big fan of choice-based analytics, and I think that that's something that people can provide insight on. So I think that's one, is that we have to always be careful. Are we asking people something that they can thoughtfully give us an answer to? And then I think the other piece is, for most research, there's primary consumer research, there is some kind of inherent bias there. And so the real value in this research is having something to compare it to. So having something foundational. And so in the example that you just gave, it's people's claimed behavior in the absolute may not be all that useful. If I have a very consistent experiment that I've run maybe hundreds or thousands of times, where I can look at how people have claimed that behavior and I can look at it versus a comparative metric or comparative database, then I start to get more insight out of that activity. And so I think that's the piece that I've certainly learned, is that I'm very comfortable that there's an inherent bias in many times in primary consumer research. You have to make sure that you take steps to make sure that bias is consistent, so that you're replicating what you've done in the past, and then you have to have something to compare it to. So I think that so I think that's the piece that I've often taken away from this, is that there are certain behaviors that people just have a really hard time expressing. So we have to acknowledge that, respect that, and think about ways to structure our experiments or our research to take that into account.
Understood. Dirk, earlier you alluded to the fact that you've also worked in retail bank. So I know that's a totally different domain than a CPG or FMCG. But yeah, this experiences always help. Does the consumer insight process change when you are asking someone to trust with their life savings versus something like, hey, buy a bottle of shampoo or a chocolate? Is the methodology different?
Yeah, it's a good question. So it's something when as I mentioned before, I've had the good fortune of working with some great companies and more importantly, some really great people. So I've really been fortunate. Like, as I've gotten older, like I found that matters to me more. When I was first approached by the bank about this opportunity, so it was kind of a relatively new role, and I remember that the person who was going to be my boss, the chief marketing officer at the bank, yeah, I had told him at first I was very skeptical. I'm like, I don't know that I'm the right fit. I've never worked in retail banking before. I've spent all of my career working consumer packaged goods. That this is going to be something totally new. I'm not sure I'm the guy for you. And I remember very distinctly, he had said, like, look, the banking part, if you can balance your checkbook, I can teach you the banking side. What we really need is someone who can bring these principles around how do we think about a more consumer or customer centric decision making process. And so how do we think about incorporating the voice of our consumer or client into these business decisions? So it's when they said that, I really piqued my interest and said, okay, well, maybe this is somewhere. And to their credit, like when I entered that organization, they were very open to this outsider who maybe was using different tools or different ways of thinking about consumer behavior and kind of embracing that and saying, yes, this is going to help us make better decisions. So I think like a key difference there is obviously when I moved into retail banking, what impressed me is that, when you think about doing research or insights in CPG, you're spending about half your time just trying to find the consumer. So how do I go identify people who have bought my product? Well, at the retail bank, you have a wealth of transactional data, of informational data about your consumer base that you can mine and get into. And so that was it was an amazing experience to be able to have access to that level of data and being able to use that to help understand things like the performance of different marketing programs, or being able to have a very tight control over the connection between activities and action. And so being able to see, here is what we did, and this is the impact that it had in terms of balances or new account openings or retention of consumers and so forth. So I would say that, yes, that some of those tools differ primarily because you have the opportunity to unlock and leverage new data or new information that maybe you don't have in every industry. But the foundational piece of how do we think about giving the people that matter most to us a seat at the table for these important decisions, that's something that is consistent. And I find that in my role now as a consultant, as I look across lots of industries, that's the piece that's powerful, that when you have organizations that really want to listen to their consumers and are open to that, that's the key.
Great. It is often said that the consumer level insights are like a microscopic view, and the category or market level trends are like something like an eagle's eye view, right? So when you advise clients on marketing and strategy, how much weight do you assign to consumer weights versus, let's say, the larger marketing trend or the category trend?
Yeah, I love the question. And when I look at the work that I do, like, because many times, and I will oftentimes struggle to completely describe like the type of work that I'm involved in. But the types of client engagements that I work on, I have client engagements where I'm working on deploying marketing performance analytics and results to their organization. Like, how do we think about improving our marketing ROI, and how do we think about using the insights coming out of a mixed model or an attribution model or something like that, and applying that to our business. And on the other end, it might be, how do I understand all the nuances in the path to purchase and everything that could be going into someone who is adopting a new service and so forth. So I would say that a lot of what I am trying to do is, how do you weave the narrative between these different pieces So how do I think about what it might be happening in a marketplace and the understanding? So how do I think about what are the key metrics or understanding what is going on at a market level with my brand or within my category? And then what are the whys behind that? And so then that's where I'm dipping down to understand maybe consumer level behavior to say, do we, okay, if we've seen a decline in market share, like what is that? Is that due to an effect from competition? Is it an externality within the market? Is that certainly macro effects that might be happening within the economy? But I think all of those they eventually lead back to the consumer. And so if there's inflationary pressure in a marketplace, well, how that plays out is a change in what the consumer is making, decision making at an individual shopping cart level. So I would say that for almost inevitably, I had very few engagements that don't touch on both the market and the consumer in some meaningful way. So, and I think if you follow one, you do that. If you only look myopically at one, you do that at your own peril. You really need to understand, okay, if I'm just focused on the consumer and I'm naive to everything else that's happening, then it's very hard to understand consumer behavior. And if I'm just looking at macroeconomic metrics, then it might be very difficult for me to understand the whys behind that. So I really think that trying to find, and it's very easy for me to say this here in our conversation. It's very difficult to sometimes put that in practice when I've got a fixed budget, I have limited data and so forth. But I think always trying to strive to bring the information together, I think is important.
No, this was very insightful, Dirk. Yeah, I mean, of course, you have heard of a lot of paradoxes, right? For example, consumer level insights kind of disappear at a macro level, but the macro level insights do not, come through to the consumer level. So yeah, if both the things happen. So yeah, we need to keep our eyes out for both of the trends. You talked about MMM, right? What is marketing effectiveness according to you? And have you adopted techniques like MMM in your career?
Yeah, sure. So as I mentioned before, like I've had the good fortune, especially when I was at Procter and Gamble, it was at a time when marketing mix was really just getting started. So it was at a time where if you think about when marketing mix first got up and running at P&G, it was a fellow by the name of Joe Ariyama who came in when Procter acquired Clairol, I believe. And Joe is a fantastic guy. He's now a CEO of a large auto parts distributor around the United States, and he's doing great work. But at that time, he was really standing up marketing mix at P&G, and there were a couple of suppliers who he had identified and kind of divvied up the business between them. And so I had a first-hand seat to see like how does an organization start from really this idea of not having used any of these tools or techniques really at all. And some people are surprised. It's like, oh, well, I assumed P&G had been using this for a long time. I think that over time, I think that Unilever and others in that marketplace were probably ahead of P&G at that time. But what it takes to both stand up those tools, but then also how do you drive those insights into action, and how do you encourage adoption? What is the change management that's required to get that up and running? And so, yeah, to answer your question, I'm a big fan of this space. I never want to be the smartest guy in the room. So I tell people that there was a time and place in my career, like when I was in graduate school, I don't know, like I could prove the central limit theorem. I could do all this. Like I was mathematically much more capable than I am today. So I'm not the right person to be the one like creating the models, or like yourself. Like I think you and your colleagues are really pushing, like, how do we think about continuing to push this forward and push these models and these tools in the cutting edge. But I think being able to look at these with a critical eye. So how do you evaluate the tools? How do we think about operationalizing them? So how do we think about the challenges going to market with some of these tools? And then how do you think about effectively making decisions with the insights. So I think that's one of these things that I've gained a lot of experience and respect for these tools and the ability to have meaningful impact on marketing performance and marketing ROI. So I'm a big fan. I've used, I've seen the evolution of mixed modeling over years. I've seen, when I was working at Nielsen, I worked quite a bit with mixed modeling and how do we think about the intersection of store level modeling with market level modeling and all the challenges that entails, and price and promotion modeling versus pure marketing mix. So it's a fascinating space, and one that I think is incredibly impactful when it's used properly, and something that's also, frankly, very easy to make a mess of as well if you're not thoughtful with how you approach it.
Exactly. I mean, 10 years ago, when I got started with one of the questions that I always had was, hey, how do the clients think? And of course, you have been on both the sides, right? Both the client as well as on the agency side. It's a very peculiar relationship, right? The client agency relationship. What is something you wish external partners and agencies better understood about the reality of, sitting on the client seat?
Yeah, of course. So, and I think, and especially since you brought it up, I'll speak specifically around mixed modeling and
Mhm.
marketing performance. Is that it is something that that I definitely have an appreciation for, and I think about that with my clients. Is that I think many times, having sat the the on the supplier side, I think that on the supplier side, we don't always understand everything that the client is dealing with. So we don't
Mhm.
always have a full appreciation for the challenges that the client may face with like
Mhm.
data acquisition. Like when you think about mixed modeling, I think that it is obviously only as good as the data and the insights that are only as strong as the data that you're bringing in. And so many times I've seen where these engagements fall apart is the supplier doesn't have an appreciation for how difficult it is for the client to chase down the data or the information. And they're just prescribing this to say, this is what we need for us to go off and run this. And they're really not, the distinction between a vendor and a partner is that the partner is saying, I'm going to be there with you to help work through the complications, the messy parts of data acquisition and so forth. So I think sometimes there's a lack of appreciation. I think there's also sometimes on the vendor side, there may not be a full understanding of the systems and the organization in place on the client side on how they're going to push these insights into action. So a good example might be within the area of marketing performance. Many times we're looking at, especially if we're taking like our historical results and trying to think about what might happen in the future. And I think like one of the challenges we face are things like, and again, this is not an area that I want to wade into, but you think about like the frequentist debate versus Bayesian and so forth. And it's like one of the challenges you have many times, like with a Bayesian model, is I am maybe changing or updating my priors, or I'm informing the model with new information, and all of a sudden my historical data is all going to change. And that is
Mhm.
incredibly confounding if I am like a marketing organization wants to say, what is the marketing ROI on this piece of copy last year? Like how did that perform? And many times it's like I need to enter that into a system of record in my company. Like I have to put that in a field in SAP, or I have to do something with that piece of information. And it's a single integer that I need to type in. I can't be a range. So it's like dealing with and understanding what is the client doing with our insights, and how do we take our methodology and make sure that we're being thoughtful with how they're going to make decisions. And it doesn't mean that we're always like, we can't challenge our clients. I think that's a part of what we're being paid to do. It doesn't mean that we are dumbing everything down, like that we should not be just like, we're dealing with complexity. And so we should be helping them understand and embrace that. And it's to our own peril if we dumb this down to a point that ignores that. But I think that's the challenge that we face as external partners, is how do we take this complexity and make it actionable? How do we take this and put it in a way that they can be agile and move forward and make better decisions for marketing allocation in this case? So it's a very long-winded question to your answer, so I apologize, but it is something I'm really passionate about, is that idea of having an appreciation for the challenges that we both face. And I think on the client side, I think more often than not, they have no idea what it takes to get this work done. And so I think a lot of times they're like, we are going to them with a smile and with a report or with a platform and what have you, but they don't always have any appreciation for how difficult this can be. And so I think a really strong partnership is when we as an external partner have an appreciation for the demands our client have, but the client also has to have an appreciation for how hard it is to come to the table as an external partner and make these recommendations. And so I think when that works, it's great. And when it doesn't, it can be messy. So.
Yeah, I think in this regard, education certainly helps both the client and the vendor, right? I mean, the vendor can get to know, hey, what are the difficulties faced by the client? I mean, some time ago, we had one scenario where, the client had provided all the data to us. It's a big, large CPG company. Of course, they had very sophisticated methods, but they somehow missed out on a particular variable, right? And we had already started modeling, and we were almost on the verge of delivering the results. And then they found that out and they said, hey, here's this one variable we missed out. Can you just plug this in? But it's not very easy to just plug it in and, get out the results. Everything is going to change. The dynamics are going to change. And we are not going to deliver the results within the next 1 week. So, yeah, I mean, if the client appreciates the challenges that is there, it's a win-win situation for both the client and the vendor.
Yeah, exactly. I think you said it well. And I think many times if there's I think complications arise. There's unexpected iteration occurs.
Yeah.
This is a reality of any business, and so I think a healthy relationship though is there's a mutual appreciation. So like I find that you said it well with the example that you just shared. Like if a client is coming to me and they recognize that this is a complication, they're asking for like what are the potential solutions, and there's an appreciation if I'm able to help them, and they understand that I'm going above and beyond, then I think that's a healthy relationship. It's when you get into an unhealthy situation when the client just is expecting, saying, "Well, you go do it. It can't be that difficult." That you kind of leads you to a place where the value you're providing is being discounted. They're really not fully understanding the work, and also sometimes I think you said it well, like the educational piece. Like if they're coming to you and saying, "Okay, you just put this in," they probably don't have a great understanding about how much work goes into this.
Yeah.
And so I think having some level of appreciation of that is healthy for the client. Yeah.
Yeah. Uh, Dirk, I'm also a statistician. So in my world, when I look at all the things statistical, there is a definitive, black and white. There's a definite truth and false. But when I cross over the border and come to the marketing realm, a lot of things are in gray, right? There is no definitive truth. Most of the things feel like a line drawn on the sand, and it just gets erased. I mean, if you follow LinkedIn, somebody would, post saying that, hey, there is something known as brand equity. There is no top of the funnel. There is no funnel concept at all. But then somebody else will say, hey, no, that's all rubbish. There is a definite, funnel. Uh,
Yeah.
where do you stand on this? Why is there so much of back and forth happening in marketing? There's always a debate, whether something exists or something doesn't exist.
Yeah, well, I think we all know why there's the debate. And fundamentally, someone is trying to sell a book or they're trying to sell a way of thinking. And so
Mm,
I hate to see it. Like I'm
mm,
like you, like it's something where I think it's probably part of my upbringing is that that idea of of attacking someone sometimes just is something that is like, oh, it's unfortunate. And I think the other piece for me, as I alluded to earlier, like foundational for me, like some of my earliest insights around the social sciences was looking at or critique of what happens when we apply methodologies and approaches used by the physical sciences into the social sciences. And I think that it's sometimes we do it at our own peril when we make these claims about marketing laws. And I think that I'm a big believer in, like, you have to be careful with your semantics in the language that you use. And so, like, double jeopardy is a good example where it is absolutely a an empirical regularity that double jeopardy occurs, and you could take that to the bank. Like, that is something that I would build a brand and build a business around, that principle. It is not a physical law. It is,
Yeah.
at the end of the day, double jeopardy is driven by people who have agency and who make decisions in a marketplace. It is not driven by electrons, which act the same way now as they did a million years ago. And so when you're dealing with decisions and behavior in a marketplace, that you can learn a great deal by looking at what's happened historically. You can learn a great deal about understanding that behavior, but you need to be very careful that you understand that there is still a range of outcomes, and assign some different probabilities to those outcomes in the future. And so I think that's the thing that I've observed with a lot of these debates, is that people spend a lot of time and energy and continuing to ratchet up their argument to where it is like, this is an immutable truth. Like, this is how the world works. And I think when you get to that level, it's kind of to your own peril. Now, I think there is something to be said for having a set of principles, and I'm very principle based myself in terms of how do consumers work in a marketplace. How do we think about consumer behavior? And marketing principles, I think, are really important to have to be able to run a business. But I think you need to understand that there is, like, this underlying decisions and behaviors that are very difficult to predict, that sit underneath all that.
Great. Dirk, I have worked with Americans and American companies for almost a decade. I consider Americans to be the greatest marketeers on the planet, compared to all of them. Uh, and also because I've been closely following them, I would say that people ask me which is the best media agency. I would say it's WWE. Sometime I'll explain why, but they had the power to also influence social life and also political life. But also, America also gives a lot of fodder to the world in terms of, rebranding and all this stuff. Very recently, I think beginning of the year, we had this Jaguar rebranding and Cracker Barrel rebranding.
Oh,
Uh,
yeah.
do you think rebranding is a good idea? Has consumer insight ever informed the brand to do rebranding?
Yeah, yeah. Well, of course, and you mentioned, like, our LinkedIn. Of course, anytime something like
Yeah.
this happens, everyone has an opinion. Cracker Barrel is a great example where everyone is just, and I get a little bit of humor having my morning coffee and seeing all these people are like, I told you this was never going to work, and here's all the reasons why. I'm sure there's a lot of really thoughtful people that were in each of those organizations that thought it was a good idea. I think, to answer your question, I think more often than not, when you think about changing a brand in the marketplace,
Mhm.
you those examples that you provided, I think they've lost sight of what are some of the core aspects or some of the core assets that those brands have that you
Mhm.
want to drive consistency with. So I'm a fan of, yeah, we talked about different marketing philosophies. I think distinctive brand assets are important, and having assets that help to build mental associations with your brand is important. And you're investing a lot of time, energy, and resources in helping to establish those connections. And the 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 imagery you use, sometimes the sounds or audios that you use, the smells, like the sensorial pieces of your brand, I think, are important to making these connections. Now, that doesn't mean that a brand shouldn't evolve or change over time. But I think that in the cases that you outlined, it seemed like there was not as much time spent to understanding what are the associations people have with some of those assets, and how
Mhm.
much do we need to keep those, or how do we thoughtfully evolve those assets, so that there's still consistency. And so, I think for every Cracker Barrel, like I think there are examples of where brands have evolved well, like here in the States, and I think in other markets as well. You have like Old Spice at Procter and
Mm.
Gamble, which is a good example. When you look at Old Spice, it now caters to a younger demographic. It has the marketing messages that are sometimes more a little bit more provocative or more interesting to a younger demographic. But if you look at the brand itself, like the brand icons haven't really changed. The assets themselves haven't really changed. It's you can still see when you go to the retail outlet and you're looking at the shelf or you're looking at a planogram, you can pick out the Old Spice deodorant or the body wash, and you understand those are the same brand. And so I think those are some of the aspects that you say you want to be careful when you are playing around with the core definition of your brand. But certainly you can evolve your brand and look for ways to have a message that piques the interest of different consumer audiences or looks at an opportunity to expand your brand by speaking to maybe audiences that you weren't as relevant in the past. So I think that's the piece that I've taken away from some of those most recent kind of highly publicized, I guess, failures that have occurred in those cases where it's when you take something as iconic as Jaguar and you completely change that logo where people can't really associate that with the brand, it's to what end? Like what's the point of that? And I think if it's hard to answer that question, then you say, well, maybe that's not the right path. So.
Understood. Just a tangential question. Do you think it's also about trust when it comes to, product suggestions? I have had instances where, my friend uses Old Spice because his father or, uncle uses it and they suggested it to him. And he wouldn't, perhaps believe, a Tom Cruise or a Will Smith, but he would trust his own father or uncle more than them.
Yeah, of course. And I think that's kind of what I was alluding to before is that when you think about what drives the choices that you're
Hmm.
making, I think that's a very reasonable decision. So an endorsement from your uncle is more important than an endorsement from Tom Cruise. And so I think but then to really understand how that brand plays in the marketplace, like, well, how important is that endorsement related to the price and the price elasticity of the brand. And
Hmm.
so, yeah, maybe you're willing to pay a little bit of a premium, but would you
Hmm.
pay twice as much as another
Hmm.
brand you're not as familiar with? And so I think that's where it really becomes powerful is that understanding the relative importance of something like a trusted endorsement. I think that for it to be really useful and actionable is that when you put it in context with everything else that might go into you making that decision. And I think that goes back to the point I was making before. Like you said it well. Like that's a great example of where there's other ways you can make a decision in the category. You
Hmm.
could go online and spend a lot of time researching the efficacy of different deodorant brands, and you could do like spend a lot of time in research understanding the what are the active ingredients and so forth and so on. I suspect you have a very busy day. And maybe you're not going to have time to spend a couple of hours researching your deodorant. So I think that's a perfect example of where you have an aided judgment to make a very quick decision at point of purchase, and that's what I think most consumers do.
We just went past Black Friday, Cyber Monday. It's a very American thing, but it's caught on with the rest of the world as well.
Mhm.
And we deal with a lot of, both American clients and, European clients, and they ask us, hey, can you tell us the impact of these discounts? Do discounts during these times work? What does Consumer Insights tell us?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that it's certainly I'm always hesitant to paint with too wide a brush, but I think more often than not, you see this primarily with the market data, is that these types of discounts, you're really drawing purchase behavior forward. So that it's very seldom are you driving a great deal of incrementality as you think about this over multiple purchase cycles. Is that so? The discount in the sense, yes. I mean, are you having an impact at a point in time? Yes. But is it how much is that really driving incremental sales for your brand. And then I think there is a long-term aspect to this as well, in that we're changing the way people think about or the way they interact within the marketplace. So in some cases, when taken to an extreme, I'm not going to make a purchase until I get that discount, and so I'm expecting the discount. You see that a lot with like fashion retailers here in the U.S. are a good example. There's some retailers that, anecdotally, I'm not going to buy the whatever my sweater unless I get the 40% off discount. And a 20% off discount? Are you kidding me? That's not, why even bother? So I think that it's yes. So I think that in all of our marketplaces, we understand that that there is a push to squeeze profitability out of the market, and these are competitive marketplaces. And so when you think about offering discounts, you need to be very thoughtful in terms of what is that doing, where is that sourcing your volume from, and then importantly, what are the implications longer term? Like, is it something that is going to change people's perception of the value of your product? So.
A related topic, associated with Black Friday is always that, brands would say, I would have got the sales because it's just Black Friday. How much incrementality did we do because of our own campaigns, right? And often this word incrementality has also become a buzzword of late. You must have seen it on LinkedIn. What is your opinion on this?
Yeah, it's a good question. And so it's something where my take on the concept of incrementality is that, I mean, certainly I think there is value, and especially you handle this every day in the marketing mix space or marketing performance space, is like, how much of our sales can we think of this as like our baseline sales, and how much of it can be attributed to the activity that we have had. And so I think the ability to understand that there is some level of baseline sales and consumption on most brands or all brands is something that is important. And then how do we think about that waterfall for all the activities, and how do we tease out the sales that might be associated with those? And so, I think that conceptually there's nothing wrong with how looking at that and looking at the marketplace in that way. I think that you're right that when you think about incrementality, what I see where we oftentimes fail is that it's like, are you thinking too myopically about your source of volume? And so is it that this was really incremental to your brand, or are you sourcing this from something else in your franchise? So this is actually volume that moved from your core brand to your new line extension. And so the line extension is growing, but the total franchise is remaining static. And that might be okay, because it might be your new line extension is at a premium price and has a higher margin. And so that's exactly the behavior you want. But don't kid yourself that all of that is incremental. And so I think that's the piece. And also you have to be very careful, like their claims around like growing category or growing category usage. And again, I think I approach that really skeptically many times. Is that real? Are people really buying more of this product in general, or using this more? They're finding more usage occasions or not? And I think that's a pretty high bar to be able to have evidence that that's what's happening. But I will say this, I think that really large brands, I think it's important to understand that a very subtle change in market share can have a dramatic impact on brand profitability, because of when you think about how these brands are structured and how they go to market and the supply chain and so forth. And so I certainly am not, I don't work in finance, but I've spent enough time working with really smart finance people to understand and appreciate that when I first started my career, I would think about, oh, this seems like a really small, like incremental growth. But on a large, well-established brand, that'll make or break your year. And so I think those are things that, when you think about the concept of incrementality and the importance of any level of growth and market share, that sometimes it's important to keep in mind that it's having a disproportionate impact generally on profitability. And so I think that that idea of relatively small changes matter. So.
Got it. Of course, in marketing, there are a lot of dichotomies. There is this brand marketing, and then there's this performance marketing. Do you think good brand marketing makes performance marketing work harder?
Yeah, I mean, I think the two go hand in hand. So I
Mhm.
do think that and again, this kind of goes back to these religious debates that you sometimes see online. That's one that I don't understand. Like I
Mhm.
think about this idea of like establishing a strong brand and building on a brand's equity. I think go hand in hand with being thoughtful about your marketing tactics. And so the two, like I don't buy into this idea that the if I am investing in the how do I continue to grow in my brand, how do I win in the short term versus competition, and how do I think about using some of these more like tactical levers
Mhm.
that isn't having a fundamental impact on my long-term brand equity. So I think that's one that yeah, it is probably, maybe I should invest a little more time investigating, but I don't see what all the fuss is about in that particular space. Like I don't see those diametrically opposed. I think like healthy brands will perform really well when you think about like opportunities to grow the brand. And likewise, a brand that is struggling or has not identified or is not doesn't resonate very well with consumers, that it's going to be really difficult to see a strong ROI on many of their marketing outlets. So
Um, there is also the debate about B2B and B2C, right? People think marketing applies differently to B2B and it applies differently to B2C. Of course, your company works with both B2B and B2C businesses. Uh, do insight tools and techniques developed for, let's say, B2B apply to B2C or vice versa?
yeah, it's a good question, and and what I have found is, and I like you said, I've had the opportunity to work with many clients who are both in the B2B and obviously the B2C space. What I find is that it kind of goes back to the point before. Most of my B2B clients, they still have an inherent interest and desire to influence a marketplace, and like I need to go win in a competitive marketplace, and usually that marketplace involves an end consumer in some way. And so even though I might be manufacturing a product that's being incorporated into another product or so forth, eventually that is ending up in the hands of a consumer, or that's a service that's being adopted by a consumer. So I find that like for most of my B2B clients, there is still that inherent desire to understand, well, what is the size of that market? And how do I think about where is that market growing or is it declining? And how do I think about how I can provide a more persuasive message to influence manufacturers or my clients to adopt my product? So I think that those principles about understanding the marketplace are still pretty consistent. And in many times, the data that we're collecting is very similar. So it might be that we're gathering data from a household panel or syndicated scanner data or some of these things that we use quite a bit in the B2B B2C space are still very applicable in the B2B environment as well. So
Uh, would you say that the fundamentals of marketing applies to both B2B and B2C? I mean, it's the same four P's, right? Product, price, place, promotion. I would opine that at least for B2B, it is the crucial differences in the time, right? I mean, people
yeah.
take a lot more time to, make a decision in B2B. And of course, the number of competitors that you have in B2B is a little bit lesser as compared to B2C, right?
Yeah, no, completely agree. I think it's I totally agree with your thesis, and it's an excellent point. Is that that I have not found any examples where these principles are not consistent across B2C and B2B. And it's really, like you said, it's yes. And you find that in any market, like there are differences in terms of purchase cycle. There might be differences in terms of the number of players in the marketplace. But I think that same idea of like, how do you grow your brand in a B2B space is that you still like, how do I make myself available to my end consumer? So how do
Mhm.
I find like where is the market? How do I make sure that I'm participating in that market? And then how do I build relevancy by like making some mental attachment to what my product or service is? So like that's the point of most of my advertising is that yes, like you might have this concept of of a light buyer or an infrequent buyer, but how do I continue to use marketing and communication to build those connections for when that consumer enters the marketplace, that I'm relevant and that I'm going to be part of their consideration set. So.
Got it. Yeah, so we are nearing the end of our podcast, Dirk. My last question to you would be that of course you have a such wealth of knowledge, 20 plus years of experience. I'm sure you must have learned a lot of lessons. What is one thing that you would like to share with someone beginning a career in consumer and marketing insights?
Gosh, it's a good question. I think that what has served me well is curiosity and having an inherent sense of curiosity and not being afraid to wade into areas that look a little challenging. So, like for me, even today, like I am fascinated by large language models, and I'm doing everything possible as someone who is not a native person in this space to really get grounded in it. So like when I see, yeah, it's funny, keep harping on this, but you'll see on LinkedIn, everybody gets like, oh, look, Chat GPT can't even spell strawberry right, or blah, blah, blah. Like none of these things work, and look, all these hallucinations. That's not how I react. Like I look at that and say, well, why is that? Like that, why is it that the model would have that? And if you understand how these models are built and how they're trained, it shouldn't be that surprising. And then if you did that, then you could kind of get, well, how would I then operationalize that? And so like when I'm using LLMs, like I think about like many times an LLM model may not do foundational math very well, but it can write code that does the math, and I can look at the code. So it's like, how do you start to think about these and be curious? And I think if you're curious about your tools, if you're curious and respectful of the consumers and the marketplace, and you approach it humbly, I think that can get you, it can take you very far. And so I think that would be the thing that I would encourage as someone might be starting out their career, or someone is that be curious and be humble. And I think that it's that you could do a lot worse than if you started out there. So.
That was an excellent message, Dirk. Thanks for your time. This has been really wonderful, and thanks for sharing all your wisdom, Dirk. It was a pleasure having you.
Oh, well, no, I want to thank you. I think that that having these type of resources, I've really enjoyed listening to some of the previous podcasts, and it's especially, I think what you're doing, it's getting a wealth of different ideas and opinions, and I think that you and your colleagues seem quite open to that, and so I'm excited for the work that you're doing, and I wish you continued success and all the best in 2026.
Thank you, Dirk. Wish you the same.
Yeah. All right. Take care. All right. Bye.